Okay. Content. All right, let's get started here. Hey, I swear, we'll never let them book me 2 classes back to back ever again. Okay, what do I think about Trump's boys leaking war plans in a chat group? Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't expect great competence from Trump or his people. Okay, so we're talking about religion today, right? So we're going through this particular topic, which is fun for me anyway. All right, so we're going to keep going with that, and after this, we've just got the one other topic left, right, which is education. So we'll go through that, and we'll kind of see where we end up, right? We've got, I think, essentially 5 lectures left. That last lecture is sort of reserved by me for just review or cleaning up bits if we're not quite where I want it to be, but it looks like we're going to end either on time or a little bit early. So let's continue talking about religion, right? I guess so we ended, kind of talking, we had our couple of definitions of religion, right? We were talking about our structure, or our functional and our substantive definitions, and we talked about what sociologists are kind of interested in when we talk about religiosity in particular, right? So we measure things like belief, belonging, and behavior, right? The 3 B's of sociology of religion. And we talked a little bit right at the end about how, religiosity, at least from a sociological perspective, religion is a learned behavior, right? It's something that you learned. Not something, that is inherent to people, right? If there are no kind of social cues around you, you don't learn it, right? So you need opportunity, right? Somebody has to be there to teach you about religion. You have to have need, right? A reason to turn to religion, and you have to learn about it, right? There has to be things that you actually learn. You're not going to spontaneously manifest the 3 B's if you didn't kind of go through these things. Okay, so Canada, right? So Canada, somewhat of a funny place religiously, kind of midway between Western Europe and the United States. So we talk religion and society, right? Generally speaking, when we think of Canada, right, we think of Canada as being a secular society. One where religion isn't supposed to impinge on the public sphere, right? Generally speaking, since kind of the Enlightenment, right, since the 19th century, and certainly through the 20th and into the 21st century, the kind of goal has been to push religion more and more to kind of the social edges, right? So that it has its sphere, but its sphere is kind of private, right? So now Canada, we still have pretty high levels of religious belief. Like actual adherence to particular religions is declining, especially kind of major Protestant denominations, and a little bit with Catholicism as well. We're seeing declines in religious belief. When we talk about like just straight up belief in God, it's about 3/4 of the population that still say they believe that there is a God that exists, whether they're religious or not. But when we talk about, the role that it has in people's everyday lives, it's pretty clear, right? And I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that religion and the scope of religious authority, has declined, right? People don't listen to religious officials as much anymore, and certainly, where maybe what the bishop had to say about a particular topic used to be really important to people. Now people are making their decisions more based on kind of personal factors. So in lots of ways, Canada, at a sort of micro level, right, the level of your personal life, most Canadians' lives are pretty secularized, right? You're probably not making decisions on how many children you're going to have, where you're going to live, how you're going to spend your money based on religious concerns. That's not very typical. At the same time, though, religious issues still intrude on public life in, interesting and complex ways, right? There's always these moments where governments end up being drawn into questions and debates about religion because, it's often framed in the language of rights. And sometimes, it's like religious freedom versus some other right. Right? So religious freedom versus let's say in the debate around medical assistance in dying. You cannot see my red pen. I'll change to orange here. Medical assistance in dying, right? Or MAID. When MAID was legalized a few years ago, right, one of the big questions, and one actually I don't think has been particularly well answered by the government, was around, okay, we're going to have medical assistance in dying, but we've got, things like doctors who are religious, and we've got a series, all over the country, Alberta in particular, of religious hospitals. And what do we do when these two kind of rights, say a right that we've said people have a right to terminate their own lives and seek medical assistance in doing so, but what do we do when that kind of runs into, particular religious concerns? And I think this is a thing that, in the case of MAID, they kind of have sort of brushed it to the side and said, well, we'll let, these particular institutions of people make their own determinations, but they should, refer to people who will, even though, in particular cases that violates their conscience as well. And so government is going to keep getting drawn into this as, religious rights and other rights kind of bump up against each other. And this happens, every decade or so, we get a big issue around that. Okay. And yeah, when two rights are kind of pitted against each other, the state has the task of finding an acceptable solution. And in Canada, this is made more complex by the fact that, we don't have, in a sense, enumerated rights. There isn't a sort of which right supersedes another one, right? They're all kind of seen as equal in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, for example, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, right? The U.S. Constitution, right, they're kind of enumerated, right? And religious freedom is right at the top, so that's the one that tends to get priority. In Canada, it's a little bit different, right? All of these rights are seen as equal, so typically courts have to kind of figure out what to do with it. And yeah, we think of religion as sort of private, like what you do in your own home between you and God. There's lots of cases where religion and kind of broader society bump into each other. People bring their religion into the public sphere. I saw that Mark Carney was asked a couple of days ago, because he's Catholic, what his stance on abortion was. I didn't actually listen to the answer because I actually don't care. I think abortion is one of those weird canards in Canadian politics. We always talk about it. No one's ever going to change any of the laws because it's an absolute landmine that no one wants to step on. But, I saw that he was asked about it. Right, because it's okay, where does your religion kind of situate you in terms of this other right that we believe people have? Okay, and yeah, even though, we have a growing number of Canadians that say they're not religious, there's also evidence kind of, and this seems to come and go, every now and then there's these sort of religious awakenings, and we do see religious awakenings kind of happening, and especially, one of the big ones that we see is amongst young men. Young men in Canada and the US, weirdly in the last maybe 5 years, have started to become more religious, which is really odd. Men typically, the trajectory for 100 years has been men becoming less religious, and just in the last couple of years, we've started to see reversals in that. And yeah, we have new religious movements that spring up all the time and attract converts, either straight up cults, right? Or, well, sometimes sects of religions that already exist, right? Like a new Islamic movement, a new Jewish movement, a new Christian movement that kind of springs up. And yeah, if anything, religion in Canada, for the people who remain religious, is becoming much more traditional and conservative, as a lot of the people who are more politically and socially liberal kind of attrite out of these communities, right? And actually move into non-belief in a lot of cases. Or, if you're a mainline Protestant, because the mainline, their average age is 65 and above, so these are your older Protestant churches, the people just die. Okay, wow, I wrote a lot of things there. So, Durkheim's approach. So, one of the things, Durkheim, I guess it's worth noting, we talk about the kind of three big kind of early sociologists, right? We're talking about Marx, we're talking about Durkheim, and we're talking about Weber. All of them were atheists, right? So none of them believed a single word of kind of what was in religion. And so they all approached religion basically from a materialist perspective, looking at what religion does for people, right? That really was what they were interested in. And Durkheim in particular, right, was really interested in the function of religion. What does it do for the communities that it's in? Why, when we look at religion, do most societies have a religious set of beliefs? And why does it endure, right? And again, from a kind of functional perspective or a functionalist perspective, institutions persist to the extent that they play a useful role in society, right? Okay. I feel like I'm going to lose my voice there. Perfect time of the year to lose my voice. So, all right, so when people live together, right, what Durkheim says, when people live together, right, so when communities form, what you ultimately get is people come to share common sentiments and values, right? And this is sort of fundamental to social organization. In order to get along with people, you have to share certain kind of core values, right? You all have to more or less align with what you're trying to do. And this was, for Durkheim, very much what happens. And he calls this, right, so these shared values and norms that everybody kind of shares, but exist higher than the level of the individual, he calls this collective conscience, right? So these shared kind of norms and values. And basically, one of the ways that Durkheim kind of thought religion was really useful was by anchoring this collective conscience, right? These collective values in something, more than the ephemeral, right? More than the here and now, more than things that are going to change, and therefore giving them this kind of sense of being permanent, important, eternal, not having this kind of air of constant change. Okay, so on occasion, right, our collective conscience can be experienced directly for Durkheim, right? Most of the time we just kind of feel it, and it's expressed as a sort of collective thing, right? We all share the same norms, morals, values, and we kind of experience that by all expressing them in particular ways. But sometimes, people will experience them directly. And particularly, what he thought was that we create sort of rituals, right? Practices that connect you to the sacred, and items, right? Objects, that symbolize the sacred, which he calls totems. So we have rituals and totems that basically allow us to experience collective consciousness, or conscience, not consciousness. That's the Borg from Star Trek. Collective conscience directly. So what does this kind of look like, right? Well, he says that most of the time people live in what he calls the profane. right? So the everyday world, things that aren't sacred and holy, but there are parts of the world that are, reserved for those special experiences of the transcendent, which he calls the sacred. So this can be, so when we talk about rituals, I think we all kind of know what this is, right? This is like, in Catholicism, the Mass, or, Sabbath, Shabbat, in Judaism, or any, Seder in Judaism, right? The Passover feast, anything out, Diwali, right? Any of these things would be kind of rituals that people experience, some sense of transcendence through. And totems are, any items that symbolize the sacred. So this could be like from the cross you wear around your neck, or the Star of David, right to the building, right? The cathedral, the church, the mosque, or whatever, right? All of these things are kind of physical totems of some kind of transcendence. And I know the language of Catholicism better than I know a lot of the other kind of languages of other religions. So I always think of like Catholicism has a million kind of symbolic representations of the sacred, right, in it, right? So much, such a stained glass windows and all of these things that are all symbolically kind of rich in all of that stuff. Okay. Ooh. Okay, why do I think conservatism and its traditions are on the rise now, despite most of the younger generations identifying as liberal? That's an interesting question. Weirdly, I was just talking about this in Sociology of Youth yesterday. We're seeing a weird divergence. We talk about young women. Young women are becoming overwhelmingly liberal, right? But globally, we're seeing this weird kind of trend of young men becoming much more conservative. For lots of reasons. Now, I think that has to do with the fact that, that's an interesting question. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that in a lot of ways, young men are doing particularly poorly in a lot of metrics, right? Like in terms of education, educational attainment, career opportunities and attainment. Young men are slipping quite badly. They've been affected really severely by things like pornography and video games. They're drawing them into some really negative habits. And you have a lot of young men that are really, really struggling. And I think the kind of natural, I don't know if it's the natural, the inclination has been, in a lot of cases, to sort of blame, the transition to, say, something like a more egalitarian or feminist kind of society for a lot of the problems that men are having. And that's, I think, led people into this more kind of traditionalist path. I think people are also potentially finding that kind of a postmodern or late modern ideology doesn't have as much to offer as we were kind of promised. And so a lot of people are looking back to older forms. And then, of course, you have like really prominent individuals sort of pushing in this direction, through social media. And I think here of Jordan Peterson, but he's certainly not alone. And I think that's kind of pushing people in that direction of considering kind of more traditional values. Okay. You don't know if this is conjecture, but you notice a lot of new conversions, especially among traditional Catholics or Orthodox bros, are motivated by politics rather than genuine belief. I think there's certainly an aspect of that. And again, I think it maybe relates, especially in young men, to how poorly young men are doing overall. Do I think the US is going backwards in terms of secularization? I don't think the US was ever as secular as we tend to think it is. If anything, I think maybe the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, really for the millennials, right, starting in the 90s and kind of going forward, we've had a notable dip in religion. But the story of religion in the US going back to like 1776 and the founding has been one of increasing religiosity, if anything. The US is a really weird society. It's sort of gone the opposite way of, say, Western Europe. Come take social religion with me. We talk about this endlessly. But I think maybe the aberration is actually the last 15 to 20 years, not, the kind of maybe re-religizing or desecularization we're experiencing now. Men may not be doing worse, but rather appears that way since women have risen as more prominent competition due to more accessibility and opportunity. I mean, I think there's lots of ways that young men are really struggling. Economically, a lot of the, especially in North America, a lot of the jobs that men used to do have been outsourced, right? It used to be that you could easily walk out of high school and get a great job at a factory. All those jobs are gone, right? Now you need a ton of education, or what's happened to a lot of high school, people with high school or less who are men, the only jobs that are available to them are things like trucking, right? This is, and not a great job for lots of reasons, but the number one employer of men in the US with a high school degree or less is trucking companies. Just wait until Elon Musk makes all of your trucks, your semi-trucks automated. That's not going to go great. So a lot of things that men, the shift of the service economy too, away from things like trades, resource extraction, manufacturing, construction. These were predominantly male jobs that offered good wages. But as we've shifted away from those into more of a service industry, men struggle a lot more in the service industry, right? They're just dispositionally, a lot of them, not that well oriented to it. So I think there's a lot of struggles that men are having. Go die. You might think that, but probably not. I mean, unless you're going to go fight in wars. So maybe we'll have a military resurgence. I don't know. I guess we need to have a war or something. No, please no. Okay. I think some part of men's ideals are threatened by women not necessarily needing to rely on men for financial support like they used to a few decades ago. Yes. I think, don't have to handle the cyber semis won't be anytime soon. I think, automated driving is always 10 years away. So I'm going to say it's 10 years away. And in 10 years, I'll say it's 10 years away. Okay, so do I think so? Yeah, not necessarily needing to rely on men for financial support like they did a few decades ago. Oh, now you need to come take sociology of youth with me too, because we talk about this endlessly. It is an interesting question. I think to some extent, yes. I mean, this kind of change has really altered the relationship between the sexes. It's definitely, how to put this kindly? Again, there's a ton of theory here that we could go into. But I think one of the kind of interesting things, it's benefited some men a lot, right? Because some men have really got to run the field with, women, and there are many fewer marriageable or kind of marriage-minded men or kind of men that women judge as worthwhile than there were in the past. So there's a few men like at the kind of top of the social echelon, high wages, high achievements that are doing really well, and they can, get with a lot of women. And then there's a whole bunch of men that really don't bring a lot of resources to the game, and they really struggle in all aspects of life, right? And not for nothing, women have no interest in them because they don't really offer much. And unfortunately, I do think there's a bit of a crisis in men and boys, much of it of their own doing, right? And much of it related to things like video games and pornography, which are, have their problems. So we all love our video games. So I would say yes to your question. At all? Oh, I didn't know I could do that. That's cool. There we go. Okay. Shall we go back? Okay. That was fun. Fun question time. Okay. So conflict and feminist theories. And I think like conflict feminism or critical feminism, as it's often called, definitely we have strong critiques against Durkheim's theories, right? Okay, so one of the Marxist critiques of kind of functionalist theories in general is, they tend to critique the overemphasis in functional theories of how much religion maintains social stability. And what is particularly notable in terms of kind of especially Marxist or critical theories of religion is they're really concerned with the degree to which religion often kind of reinforces social inequalities, right? And especially social inequalities, between classes and between kind of sexes. So, I mean, you've probably heard, I'm assuming you've sort of heard the very famous Marxist phrase, right? Oh, do I have it on another slide? I do have it on this slide. Yes, hang on, I'll go to this slide. The very famous kind of phrase, right, from Marx, that religion is the opium of the people, right? He says it's the sigh of the oppressed creature, longing to be free. It's the opium of the people, right? And basically, when we talk about kind of, sex-based kind of inequalities and class-based inequalities, different kind of conflict theory or Marxist schools have come at these questions a little bit differently. So from the kind of feminist, right, and again, critical feminist, so linking it with that Marxist kind of frame, feminists have generally noted that religions, for the most part, traditionally place women in subordinate positions to men, right? And that this reinforces patriarchy. And I mean, there's, I think, some more nuance to this that we could talk about, but not in this class. But it's definitely a, sort of a pretty typical framing and not inaccurate, right? A lot of the kind of major religions in the world have their origins in antiquity, right, in the kind of late Roman period. And these were very patriarchal societies, and they carry forth a lot of those same norms, right? Women in a kind of subordinate position to men, as it was, back, in the Roman era, right? And this is true, for example, both of Christianity and Islam, right? Both of which come out of a kind of late Roman context. And the major world religions are becoming less patriarchal in some parts of the world, but to be honest, that's often the parts where religion is kind of shrinking and they're becoming more secular, and it looks like an adaptation to kind of survive, women's equality. In places, in a lot of other places in the world, religions remain just as patriarchal as they have ever been. Okay, I think the more interesting one, and the kind of Marxist, straight up Marxist economic critique of religion, and actually, depending on the day of the week, I either believe this or I don't, depending on my mood, I think. Marx called, suggested that religion, supports class inequality, and specifically called religion the opium of the masses. Why? Well, what Marx thought about Christianity in particular, because he's really talking about, 19th century Europe. He's not really talking about any other society, because that was the social context that he was really interested in. What was going on at that time, right, he thought, was that religion was used to kind of justify the social order, right? So that, if you were born, poor, and you were going to work in a factory, right, well, that's just where God put you. And you could tolerate that suffering, right, so you would tolerate that suffering because as long as you were a good Christian, right, you would end up in heaven. Right? And that going to heaven at the end of the day was what it was all about. And in heaven, right, then you would get your reward, right? For being a good Christian, there'd be no, tears, no hunger, no inequality, right? And, you end up in the New Jerusalem and everything is hunky-dory, right? And, there's no more any bad stuff. All of that stuff has gone away. Now, what he thought was that this was really convenient, right? He thought it was really convenient, especially for the dominant classes, and in this case, he's thinking of the bourgeoisie. Like, you can justify, the order of the world based on religious principles that support, a capitalist system where some are placed high up and some are, working basically for mere survival. And you sort of, what he says, right, you drug people, essentially. Religion drugs people. It tranquilizes them because it's like, okay, you have a garbage life in the here and now, but there's this eternal reward that happens after death, so you don't have to worry about the conditions here and now. So, don't bother overthrowing the bourgeoisie and seizing the means of production, because it doesn't matter, right? You're promised heaven in the next life, right? So, he thought basically religion was just the ideology of the upper classes, kind of used to support the dominant kind of social structure, right? whatever it was at a particular time, right? It always supported the elites. Now, I think what Marx maybe didn't see, he had a particularly irreligious frame. And what he certainly couldn't see was that religions, depending on the religion, but certainly, the big world religions kind of go either way, right? At times, they're used to support the ideologies of the powerful. At other times, they undermine those really powerfully, right? And for example, the civil rights movement, right? So in the U.S., civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement and the way that King was himself a Protestant pastor, he framed it all in Christian language. And if you ever go listen to the I Have a Dream speech, and you haven't sort of noticed, it's deeply framed in Christian language, right? He's making a very Christian argument, right? Essentially, he's making an argument, from one group of Christians, black Christians from the South, to other Christians, especially, white Protestants in the northern part of the United States, saying, look, like, we're just the same as you, we're equal. This is what Christianity teaches, that we're, none of us are different. We're all, equal before God, and therefore we should be equal in the here and now. And this argument, it took a while, but it really landed. But at the same time, right, Christian language has been used to justify things like segregation and slavery. So I think it's fair to say, as one of my intellectual heroes, David Bentley Hart, says, that the verdict of history on this point is incredibly mixed. It's much more mixed than Marx ever would have given it credit for, right? There are moments where religion very much leads to the emancipation of the lower classes, and moments where it definitely is used to control them. So the verdict of history on this point is much more 50-50, and you can, if you know history well, which Marx didn't. Marx is a bad historian. He's certainly not a classicist, so he wouldn't have understood, say, the ancient world the way, say, someone like Nietzsche would have. But if you kind of know a little bit of history, right, you can see where there's this kind of back and forth, where religion is both emancipatory for the lower classes, but also can be deeply oppressive. And so I think the verdict of history is much more mixed than what Marx might have kind of anticipated. Okay. All right, so our third cat, we're going to talk about Weber again. Now, you've already seen this video in the course, right? So you've already seen this video in the course, but I'm going to play it for you again because it talks about Max Weber and the ideas that he put forward in a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And if you go on and do more sociology, right, let's say you major or minor in sociology, you'll have to go through a course called Classical Social Theory. This is one of the books you'll read. It's a really interesting book. Has a bunch of problems, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And basically, well, why don't I play the video and then I'll sort of tell you a little bit more. Now, hopefully my sound is, yes.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Okay, so we talk about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Again, we talked about it earlier in the course in terms of symbolic interactionism. Now, again, Weber didn't believe, he wasn't a Christian, he didn't believe any Christian teaching. He was really interested, in that particular book in a very particular question, right? And he was asking, how capitalism emerged, especially in two places. One of them was England, and one of them was the Netherlands, right? Because, kind of around the time that Weber's writing, England and the Netherlands were leading industrial powers, and he was trying to figure out, what the difference was between England, the Netherlands, and places like France and Italy, right? So why France and Italy, which themselves, and certain parts of Germany, which certainly had a lot of potential industrially, why they lagged behind England and the Netherlands. And he essentially came to the conclusion that it was because they were Protestant, and, France and Italy were Catholic, and that there was a difference in the kind of values and worldview that Catholics and Protestants had that made, that early capitalist rise really happen, right? That basically it wouldn't have happened without the kind of Protestant influence, which is why he calls the book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he says specifically that it was the redefinition of a couple of really important Christian terms, right? That basically changed the relationship of the English and the Dutch to capitalism, right? And to production. And really, excuse me, my throat is really bugging me. Okay, salvation. Right? Salvation is one of the key terms, right? So how you get to go to heaven. Now, in Catholicism, right, you got to go to heaven basically through the church, right? You went and you got sacraments, you had the priest forgive your sins, you received the Eucharist, right? And that's how you got to heaven, right? It was through the church. But the Protestant Reformation kind of does away with the church. And certainly Calvin, right? So the person who is named after is John Calvin, right? He was one of the reformers. And he comes up with this idea of basically, salvation comes through, predestination. Basically, God decided from, the beginning of the universe, right? The beginning of the cosmos, who was going to end up in heaven and who was going to end up in hell, right? So the people who are predestined are the elect, and those are the people who are saved. So you have all of these Calvinists living in places like England and the Netherlands, and basically they have to figure out, okay, well, how do we get salvation? How do we know that we're going to heaven? Because nobody wants to go to the bad place. And one of the ways that they do this is they start to look for ways that they're blessed, right? So how is their, are they rich? If they're doing well, their businesses are doing well, this proves that God must have blessed them, so they must be one of the elect. And this motivates a bunch of behaviors, right? So frugality, right? Instead of spending all of their extra money, they save it and reinvest it in their businesses. They work hard, they show up on time, and all of these things that Weber calls the Protestant ethic, it's a religious motivation, but it has these sort of secular outputs. So this is for Weber to explain how something other than just straight economics, right? Because he's kind of coming at this, against Karl Marx in a lot of ways. He's looking at, okay, how can religion kind of transform the social setting, right? Okay. I do not want to play that video again. That's an interesting question. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting one. A lot of the kind of major theories, they're developed in Europe, right, and the United States. So when we talk about, a lot of sociology of religion, the kind of key theories, right, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, right, these are Europeans, they're reflecting on a European context, and even well into the later part of the 20th century, I would say sociology of religion, though it certainly looks at religions outside of kind of the West, it's still really, really focused on kind of Christianity in particular and Islam and Judaism as its kind of core set of interests. With other religions, it has a little bit more trouble dealing with them at times. Yeah, I mean, I would have to look at particular Hindu teachings. There's certainly a lot of gender inequality in majority Hindu societies, right? It's not for nothing that the British, had to ban widow burnings when they arrived in India, right? And they kind of took over India because it was like, if a man died, it was expected that his wife, in some quarters, in some sects of Hinduism, that his wife would kind of jump on the funeral pyre and burn to death with him, something the British banned. So there's certainly, Hinduism itself has certain gender inequalities. It might not be categorized in quite the same way, but I think it's certainly there at the same time. Okay. Yes, oh, sorry.
Talking about England and Netherlands being capitalism emerging Protestant, but when they have emerged because they were the ports, they were the end of the Silk Road with England, and then the Netherlands was the ports that traveled to America.
There's certainly something to that. I mean, technically speaking, France has ports as well, right? There's lots of Atlantic ports. Spain, all of these places. Spain, which in a lot of cases they had accumulated a ton of gold and silver that could have been used as investment capital from what they looted out of the Americas, right? Why didn't they develop? There's lots of ports in kind of Europe. There are very specific reasons. Weber just kind of cued in on this particular thing, right? He's looking at sort of a cultural difference, like what culturally makes France, different from England, right? He says it's France remained Catholic, whereas England, became Protestant and separated from Catholicism and adopted this particular worldview. Now, that said, I'm gonna spoil this a little bit, because there's lots of challenges to Weber's kind of account, and my kind of answer to Weber here is okay. Let me back this up half a second. Almost from the moment that Weber published this book, people have been objecting to it, and we can say of Weber that he is
wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Okay, so he's wrong, right? And it doesn't mean his work is not valuable, and I think The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism is still a really, really interesting book for the way it kind of thinks about religion. But, historians, even at the time that Weber published the book, noted that in a lot of ways, the correlation between this Protestant ethic and the strength of capitalist development was a lot weaker than Weber thought. And there are a lot of other kind of differences that made the Netherlands and England, in particular, hotbeds for capitalism. And here, Rodney Stark, who's one of my favorite scholars, he's kind of a late 20th century scholar of religion, What he notes is that what clearly makes England a hotbed of capitalism is a weak political structure. The king in England is way weaker than the king in France, right? The French monarchy was much more powerful than the English monarchy. Going back to like the 14th century, the English monarchy's power had been limited by the nobility and documents like the Magna Carta, and things like the House of Commons, right? The Parliament had a lot more power in England, so it made for a much less centralized a much less centralized political system in England. The Netherlands is similar, right? They have a pretty weak political structure, and so you get a lot of innovation. The taxes are lower. It's less likely that the state is going to come and take over your business, which spurs business. Now, that said too, lots of historians have noted, and I think this is true, that probably the actual birthplace of capitalism, in fact, is Italy, right? And especially, the Italian city-states like Milan. Milan and Naples, they were big ports as well, right? But you had capitalism emerging, or proto-forms of capitalism emerging in Catholic countries, sometimes under the auspices of the Catholic Church itself. And things like the medieval monasteries, right, where the monks live, monasteries, were actually kind of hotbeds of proto-capitalism. A lot of the monasteries really specialized in producing one thing, right? Cheese or beer or something that they then traded, with other people in communities or all over the place, in order to basically get money so they could buy the things they didn't produce. And to this day, right, some people will swear that one particular religious order, the Trappists, make the best beer. I have no way of actually attesting to that because I don't drink that much beer, but certainly I have quite a few Catholic friends who to this day insist that Trappists make the best beer. And things like banking, credit, so like loans, but loans that were made on paper rather than actually transporting big chests of gold from one place to another, are all sort of invented in Italy in the Middle Ages. And these are all the kind of things that you need for capitalism. So the kind of origins of capitalism and where capitalism thrived, it was kind of thriving in Italy for a long time prior to the Protestant Reformation. And it kind of dies down because of some political storms created by Protestantism and then sort of picks up again. So, most historians think that Weber's argument is actually wrong, but it remains an interesting kind of argument for lots of reasons. Okay, we're not going to play that again. Okay, right. So, how are we doing for time? We're doing good. All right. So, I just want to check on my overall slides here. Oh, still lots. Okay, I should have known that. So, the secularization thesis. So, one of the other kind of big theoretical concerns of sociology of religion is around this question of secularization, right? Basically, if we talk about the secularization thesis, it is an argument, essentially, that as we move into modernity, religion will fade away. And this is, a position that was shared by Karl Marx, by Emil Durkheim, and by Max Weber. And really, if we think of like the origins of sociology as being somewhere in the 1850s, or give or take, really was the dominant kind of idea until at least the 1990s, right? With the idea that as the world got more modern, right, especially as we experience things like the scientific revolution, right, and we applied human reason to human problems, that would lead to, utopia or the world getting better, and there would be less and less need for people to turn to religion. Because the assumption, essentially is that kind of Marxist one, that people turn to religion, because of hardship, because their lives suck. Okay, so that's kind of the basic theory, right? And the kind of view is a very European one, right? And yeah, secularization theory is basically religious institutions, actions, consciousness are on the decline worldwide and will one day disappear altogether as the world becomes more modern. Okay, and the kind of theory is, the church or the society in the Middle Ages, right, was incredibly religious, right? It was very, very religious. The church was the center of life, both spiritually and materially. And as we've gone forward, as the world has gotten more modern, and especially as we went through things like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, that religion becomes less and less necessary. And Weber said, right, the world had become thoroughly disenchanted. And by this he means, right, let's say, how to put this? In the Middle Ages, right, people saw spirits and demons everywhere, right? They saw, the supernatural in everything, right? They imagined that mental illnesses were demonic possession, and they thought, everything had a kind of spiritual and religious component. But as we get more towards modernity, we stop turning to the religious for a lot of these explanations, right? Like if you see someone, on the corner who clearly has schizophrenia, right? You're not going to be like, that person has a demon. You're going to be like, wow, that person needs some kind of mental health treatment, right? And so we've kind of disenchanted the world, and most people no longer think in kind of religious terms, right? We don't think that there are, spiritual forces that are affecting us, right? If suddenly you get sick, you're not like, oh man, I wonder what evil spirit has cursed me today, right? You're like, oh, it must be a virus or some bacteria or something. Okay, so Weber basically said, yeah, that by the turn of the 20th century, the scientific and other forms of rationalism were replacing religious authority. And yeah, basically this framework held until about the 1990s. For example, in the 1960s, one particular social theorist named is Peter Berger, fabulous scholar, really interesting thoughts, and very much, his thinking is the basis of social constructionism to this day. But one of the things, he was also a scholar of religion and a sort of adherent to the secularization thesis, and he said that by the year 2000, the few remaining religious people in the world would be clustered together, hiding in remote enclaves, trying to, protect their fading religious beliefs from the onslaught of secular modernity, right? And, in 1998, Berger very famously wrote a renunciation of his former beliefs, because by 1998, it was pretty clear there were still a lot of religious people in the world, and the story was much more complex. Okay, I'm looking for a question slide. I haven't seen one in a bit. Maybe I should
Wrong.
Oh, it's quiet, Dr. Cox. I do love him, but okay. All right. Just understand, right? Particular idea of salvation, right? You don't have to know. You might want to know the name John Calvin. I think it's in one question, But generally speaking, just understand that it was this Weberian kind of sense, like a change in a way of understanding the world led to something that just his kind of general idea. Okay, so I would have to check, but certainly I know the history. The British came in and banned this particular practice, and I know a lot of Hindus see it as like a cultural practice, people under the wrong influence. But there is a lot of debate on this, and it's, I think, much less clear than that. Okay. Did try to destroy Hinduism. It feels like a lot of these theories are only based on true and other fully justified and learned, because the British did try to destroy Hinduism. Very much less than they did in other places. I will say in India, the British attempts to Christianize India were very half-hearted. Not that they didn't do it, but they were much more half-hearted than what they did to indigenous people in the Americas, probably owing to the fact that Hinduism, being incredibly ancient, right, thousands of years old, incredibly well developed and supported socially, simply was incredibly resistant to British attempts to Christianize the country. It very much did not work. And Hinduism also, had very much encountered other colonizing religions like Islam, and had effective cultural defenses against both Christianity and Islam already kind of developed. So the British tried, but very half-heartedly. They were much more interested in the resources, I think. Okay, so, excuse me. So what happens? All right. So as we get more towards the year 2000, especially, it becomes clear that a lot of the predictions that have been made by Max Weber, by Emil Durkheim, by Peter Berger, and all of these folks were not ultimately going to come true. So people start to kind of rethink things, and they critique the traditional secularization theory, right? And what you get is people coming up with what's called the revised secularization theory, and this comes from Chavez, right? So Mark Chavez, a scholar at University of Notre Dame, I think he's still active. He's probably getting pretty close to retirement, but he comes up with what's called the revised or neo-secularization theory. And basically it says, okay, religions are still going to exist. Religion is a pretty durable thing, but it's going to decline in its importance, right? It's going to take on a smaller and smaller kind of role in people's lives, right? So the overall trend, diminishing importance of religion, unfolds throughout the world. And they'll point especially to things like a process they call, and they borrow this from Weber. Weber talks about this as well, about differentiation, right? And basically what they mean is, as we've gone into modernity, right, it used to be that the church, in Western societies, the church did things like education, it did healthcare, and it did things like social services. Okay? And as we go into modernity, all of these things kind of break off religion, right? They used to be these religious institutions, right? You had Catholic schools and Catholic hospitals, or Protestant hospitals, and all of these things, right? If you go to Toronto, most of the major hospitals still have some kind of at least nominal religious affiliation, because that's how it worked. But as we go into modernity, these all kind of split off from the church and become their own specialized institution. And churches and other religious institutions are left essentially only with the task of religion, right? So their kind of power over people, because of their decreased reach into people's lives, declines over time. Now that said, a lot of this is a little bit murky, because in a lot of ways, religion still has a ton of influence in things like education, through things like religious schools, religious hospitals, right? If you look at Alberta, we have religious school boards, we have religious hospitals that are still kind of operating under those auspices. So it hasn't happened as completely as even Chavez sort of figured. Okay. Oh man, throat's just killing me. Okay, so other critiques of traditional secularization theory. This idea of a separation of church and state, it's never been as complete. Okay, so there's really very few countries that have an actual legally defined separation of church and state. Any kind of British Commonwealth country doesn't have it officially. Why? Well, because, our buddy Charles III, at least titularly, is the head of the Church of England, head of the COE, right? So still kind of a religious figure in some ways. So there's never been as clear of a distinction. The US has a very clear distinction in terms of its kind of separation of church and state, although there's even there arguments about which direction that goes. Does it say religion can have no say in kind of secular affairs? Or is it the state shouldn't do anything to particular religions? And yeah, modern states tend to need to intervene in disputes over religion, especially around rights and where religious rights kind of run into other rights. And both of them make kind of incursions into each other's territory when it suits them, right? And the state is often kind of jumping into religious questions, and religions are jumping into state questions as well. And yeah, some places religious groups have successfully imposed religious rules, and in other instances, the state co-opts the function of religion, right? And you can think of, say, maybe like, I would say like the Russian Federation is an interesting example of the latter, where the Russian Orthodox Church, doing things like essentially blessing the war in Ukraine, right? Because really the Russian Orthodox Church in a lot of ways is just an arm of the Russian state, right? It depends for its financial well-being in a lot of cases on the Russian state. But yeah, religious groups, I think we don't have to think hard to see where religious groups, impose religious rules on people in all sorts of cases, right? We see that in lots of places across the world. Okay, I won't play this clip again. But now, there are critiques of revised secularization as well, and I won't play Dr. Cox. By the way, this is from a show called Scrubs, and it's freaking hilarious. Dr. House might be great, and I saw that comment. I just didn't choose to answer it. Scrubs is quite a funny show. You can find it on Disney+. It's well worth a watch. Okay, so all of our kind of theories of secularization, right? One of the big problems with them is that, despite declining institutional power in lots of places in the world, religion remains really, really important. And in a lot of cases, this kind of link of modernity to secularization has actually proven to be false, right? Because in lots of places, we've actually seen the coming of modernity actually sort of jumpstart religious revivals. So for example, right, if you look at North Africa in particular, places like Egypt, they've been Islamic for majority Muslim for a long time, but if you went back into the 1960s and 70s, the form of Islam that was practiced in Egypt was actually relatively low intensity, right? People were Muslim, but they weren't super committed to it, and the practices were pretty loose. And then you hit the 1980s, right? And Egypt goes through this tremendous modernization, and along with that modernization, a great intensification of Islamic identity and practice, right? Really kind of cranks up in Egypt. The same thing happens in India, right? Following independence from British rule, India really, really attempts to modernize. The first two Indian rulers, Nehru in particular, are very secular. We get now to kind of the present day with the current kind of leader of India, Narendra Modi. And Modi is absolutely a Hindu nationalist. And Hinduism has seen a tremendous revival, probably in the last 25 to 30 years, where the intensity of Hindu belief has also kind of really dialed up considerably compared to where it was certainly during British rule, and even potentially before that. So you've seen things like Buddhist and Taoist revivals in China, depending on what the Chinese government is doing and how tolerant they are, and things like really strong Christian growth across Asia and Africa, not driven by colonialism, but driven by kind of indigenous religious movements. And all of these things actually are not, in opposition to modernity. They really coincide with modernity in major ways. So the question is much more difficult. Okay, which religion is the fastest growing in terms of converts? Okay, so I'd have to look at the exact stats. So Islam is growing really, really quickly. But Islam's growth seems to be broadly driven by birth rates and demographics, right? Muslims having a lot of children, really quite large Islamic families remain pretty normal. That said, in terms of conversion, I think Christianity probably has the edge in terms of being able to convert people just from an ideological basis. Christianity seems to be a little bit better at converting people based on kind of sentiment and emotion. By the time we get to 2100, the number of Christians and Muslims on the planet will probably be about the same. Driven mostly, and Islam is a fair bit behind Christianity at the moment, but it's driven broadly by kind of population growth. As they say in social demography, fertility is the future, right? Or, the future is owned by the fertile. So the person who has the most babies eventually rules the world. And that's kind of the way it goes. So converts, I think it's Christianity, but overall growth, Islam is outpacing Christianity generally. Okay, is the Mormonization of North America inevitable? Yes, it is incredibly inevitable. No, it's incredibly evitable. No, I doubt Mormonism, it's really still in its infancy as a religion, right? It's gone through its really fast growth phase, and it's slowing down considerably, right? Its encounter with modernity has kind of caused it to slow quite a bit. And we're seeing kind of Mormon growth rates decline massively. Their kind of missionary efforts, especially abroad, haven't proven to be super successful in a lot of cases, and their growth is still kind of concentrated in particular areas. So I don't think the Mormonization of North America is inevitable at all. If anything, it may kind of hit its plateau within the next 50 or 60 years. I'm a Catholic scholar. Do you? Am I now? But what are my thoughts on Islam? You couldn't pay me to answer this question in a public forum. It's a religion, right? It's a religion. It has a lot of shared characteristics with Christianity. I'm going to answer this question, actually, and try not to get myself in trouble. I think all religions have particular artifices. If you call me a Catholic scholar, that's an interesting characterization. I would not categorize myself as such. I think I'm considerably more critical than that. I certainly have certain affiliations with the Catholic College here, but I wouldn't call myself a Catholic scholar. There's really interesting things about the growth of Islam, about its kind of history and its story, and I'm still learning a lot about it. That said, do I believe in Islam? No. If I believed in Islam, I would be a Muslim. I generally don't believe it, but that's true of most religions, right? And I even have quite a few critiques of Christianity. If anything, I would probably call myself more of an irreligious Christian than anything else. I don't know. I'm kind of in the Tom Holland-y school in a lot of ways. It's like I admire a lot of what comes out of Christianity, even though at times I have a hard time sort of anchoring myself down in it. But Islam, obviously, if I thought it was true, I would be a Muslim, and I'm not. So, there we go. Spider-Man's a religious scholar? I don't know what that means. Oh, Tom Holland. I got you. It's a different Tom Holland. It's a British historian Tom Holland, not actor Tom Holland. I see what's that? He is also British, but he's an actor. And so Tom Holland, the one I'm thinking of, runs a podcast called, I can't write, The Rest is History. It's a really great history podcast. You should all listen to it. And I think Holland wrote a book on Christianity, the origins of Christianity, called Dominion, which is a fabulous book. He's not, I think, Christian in any sense, but certainly admires a lot of what Christianity brought into the world, and so you can kind of put me in that camp as well. All right, why don't I leave this here? I have 5 minutes, but my throat is absolutely killing me. So let's finish religion on Thursday. Yeah, we'll get through this on Thursday, and we'll go from there. Oh, I got lots of slides left. All right, we'll pick it up there on Thursday. All right.